Hello and welcome, everyone. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. You're listening to My Strategy. We're coming to you live on the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. We're very happy to have you here today. Really glad you could join us. Our episodes are live and on Saturdays at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. Today we're going to be talking about grit. Is it a driver of achievement or a path to failure? In this episode, I'm going to talk about grit and determination. I'm going to talk about developing your mental toughness, falling in love with boredom, and we're also going to go into a little bit more detail on how grit may lead to your failure. We'd love to get your thoughts. We're taking phone calls later in the show. Studio number is 866-451-1451. That's 866-451-1451. Or you can send an email to talk@johnmhawkins.com. That's talk@johnmhawkins.com. And if you do send us an email, you'll be entered into our weekly giveaway where you get a copy of one of my books. You get to choose. And we're also going to throw in a $25 Visa gift card. I can tell you the book has gotten 4.7 out of 5 stars on most of the platforms that it is on. So we're talking today about grit. Today, for me, like any day, is a great day to reflect on our strategies and our courses of actions, what we are focusing on, what we're trying to do. Today, we're talking about grit. Now, when you think about grit, and I think about it quite a bit, we think about it from a perspective of what is grit? There's many definitions of it. Why is grit important? Grit is important, or is it? We're going to talk a little bit about developing your mental toughness. There's actually a lot of research and studies behind grit. They did some research and looked into West Point cadets. They found that they scored higher, that those who scored higher on their grit tests were more likely to succeed. They also have identified that competitors with grit do better than their peers without. We're then going to talk a little bit about something that James Clear talks about, which is falling in love with boredom. He likens grit and determination to falling in love with something that is boring. How do you go about doing that? He also talks about some of the many people who have been successful because of their grit and determination. We're going to talk about grit, and can grit cause you to fail? There's actually research that shows it's possible to have too much tenacity. Blind persistence is another way of looking at it. And then, should we believe the hype behind grit? There's definitely science behind it, but I think it's important for us to really put grit into perspective and determine how we can use it. If you do have any stories on grit that you'd like to get on the show, send an email to talk@johnmhawkins.com. We're always looking for your topics, and grit is one of those ones that I think is near and dear to many of our hearts. So grit. Let's start off with a definition of grit. Grit is the courage and resolve, strength of a character. He displayed the grit of the Navy pilot. Synonyms are courage, courageous, bravery, pluck, mettle, meddlesomeness, backbone, spirit, strength of character, strength of will, moral fiber, steel, nerve, gameness, valor, fortitude, toughness, hardiness, resolve, determination, resolution, and much more. Now, grit in psychology is a positive, non-cognitive trait based on an individual's perseverance of effort, combined with a passion for a particular long-term goal or end state, a powerful motivation to achieve an objective. This perseverance of effort promotes the overcoming of obstacles or challenges that lie in the path to accomplishment and serves as a driving force in achievement realization. It's distinct but commonly associated with concepts within the field of psychology to include perseverance, hardiness, resilience, ambition, need for achievement, and conscientiousness. So what is grit and why is it important? Got an article here by Karen Baruch Feldman. She wrote a book called The Grit Guide for Teens. She says here, to make sure we all are on the same page, here is a basic definition of grit. And this is the one developed by Angela Duckworth, who is the psychologist and researcher who coined the term. Grit is passion and perseverance for long-term and meaningful goals. She says it is the ability to persist in something you feel passionate about and persevere when you face obstacles. This kind of passion is not about intense emotions or infatuation. It is about having direction and commitment. When you have this kind of passion, you can stay committed to the tasks that may be difficult or boring. That ties in with what we're going to talk about with James Clear, where he talks about sticking to boring things. Research indicates that the ability to be gritty, to stick with these things, is important to help you bounce back from failure. It is an essential component of success, independent of and beyond what talent and intelligence contribute. This is according to Duckworth in 2016. Why is grit important? She says she's going to say it is important and it is worth repeating because what we're taught in school and our social circles, grit is important because it is a driver of achievement and success, independent of and beyond where talent and intelligence contribute. I think that's important. You can be talented, you can have intelligence, but if you do not have the will, the perseverance, the stick-to-itness to try and accomplish your goals, the odds are you're not going to be accomplishing them, and that is where grit really fits in. She says being naturally smart and talented is great, but to truly do well and thrive, we need the ability to persevere. Without grit, talent may be nothing more than unmet potential. It is only with the effort that talent becomes a skill that leads to success. She goes on to say, how can we all become more grittier? Not by demanding that they pull themselves up by their bootstraps or setting unrealistic expectations and assuming teens can meet them all on their own. For teens to grow, they need someone who can help coach them through it. So as you can see, the definition of grit, why we want to be gritty, and how it can help us. I think that as we go through the show, you're going to find that while it is important to have perseverance, the ability to have strength and courage, there's also a balancing act we're trying to do here. We want to try and figure out how do we maintain our persistence, but at the same time, we also want to be realistic with our goals. We want to start thinking about them from the perspective of what is achievable. And I think that, with grit and perseverance, having too much of a good thing can turn into a bad thing. And that's why it is important for us to not only understand and be able to be gritty when it makes sense, but also to start to think about this from the perspective of when is too much grit a bad thing? And when is it important for us to go beyond what we are trying to do with respect to only accomplishing a specific goal? You're listening to My Strategy. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Well, when we come back, we're going to talk about developing your mental toughness. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live on the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Well, I'm happy to be here with you today and really glad you could join us. My strategy is live and on Saturdays at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. Today we're talking about grit. Is it a driver of achievement and success or a path to failure? Right before the break, we were talking about the definition of grit, what it is, and why is it important. In this segment, I'd like to talk a little bit about developing your mental toughness. Some articles out there that talk about grit and being able to develop your mental toughness. We talked a little bit about the definition of grit, and as I've been going through the research, I've seen that there is a persistent theme here, and that grit is the perseverance and passion to achieve long-term goals. Sometimes you will hear grit referred to as mental toughness. And the author who coined that term is Angela Duckworth. She's a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania. And she suggests that grit is a strong predictor of success and the ability of one to reach their goals. And I've got an article here, and I do not have the author's name handy, but the title of the article is Grit, a Complete Guide on Being Mentally Tough. Now, Duckworth goes on to talk about grit and shows in her books and research that West Point cadets who scored highest on the grit test were 60% more likely to succeed than their peers. She goes on to also cite that Ivy League undergraduate students who had more grit also had higher GPAs than their peers, even though they had lower SAT scores and were deemed not as smart. When comparing two people who are the same age but have different levels of education, grit, not intelligence, more accurately predicts which ones will be better educated. Competitors in the National Spelling Bee outperformed their peers not because of IQ, but because of their grit and commitment to more consistent practice. So here we've got something that's interesting. We've got research that shows that people who might have more talent, might be gifted in certain areas, if they did not score as high on the grit test, were less likely to be successful when compared to a peer of lesser intelligence who was higher on the grit scale. There's a lot of information out here, and they talk a little bit about Professor Angela Duckworth and talks about the concept. There's lots of YouTube videos out there you can find. She goes on to talk a little bit about how to be mentally tough. So step one, define what grit or mental toughness means for you. So what does it mean for you? They give some examples here. Going 1 month without missing a workout. I assume they mean every day without missing a workout in a month. Deliver your work ahead of schedule for 2 days in a row. Calling one friend to catch up every Saturday this month. Whatever it is, be clear about what you're going after. So there it is. I think it comes down to having habits and getting in the habit of doing something. Step two, build grit with small physical wins. So we often think that grit is about how we respond to extreme situations, but what about everyday circumstances? Mental toughness is like a muscle. It needs to be worked to grow and develop. Choose to do the 10th rep when it would be easier to just do 9. Choose to create when it would be easier to consume. Choose to ask the extra question when it would be easier to accept. Prove to yourself in 1,000 tiny ways that you have enough guts to get in the ring and do battle with life. Build grit with small physical wins. And I think, this reminds me of success begets success. Small wins do help you with success, and it can help you with grit as well. Step 3 is build strong habits and stop depending on motivation. I think this is interesting. Last week we talked about motivation versus inspiration and how they are two different things. Well, grit isn't about getting an incredible dose of inspiration or courage. It's about building the daily habits that allow you to stick to a schedule, overcome challenges and distractions over and over and over again. We're going to talk a little bit later about James Clear, and he says you have to fall in love with boredom. Well, that's what they're talking about when they're talking about doing a repetitive task over and over and over again. It says here mentally tough people don't have to be more courageous, more talented, or more intelligent. They need to be more consistent. It all comes down to your habits. It's about doing things that you know you're supposed to do to be more on a consistent basis. It's about your dedication to daily practice and your ability to stick to a schedule. What are some of these examples of grit, according to this article? Mentally tough athletes are more consistent than others. They don't miss workouts. They don't miss assignments. They always have their teammates' back. What about mentally tough leaders? Mentally tough leaders are more consistent than their peers. They have clear goals that they work on every single day. They don't let short-term profits, negative feedback, or hectic schedules prevent them from being successful. It's about persevering. Well, it's not just athletes and mentally tough leaders, but everybody. In fact, mentally tough artists, writers, and employees deliver more on a consistent basis than most others. They work on a schedule, not just when they feel motivated. They approach work like a professional, not an amateur. They do the most important things first and don't shirk their responsibilities. So how do we go about gaining grit? I think it comes down to not only being prepared and being mentally tough, but it means setting goals, setting small goals, sticking to the schedules, knowing what it's about, having passion, inspiration, being motivated. A lot of those are just buzzwords. When it comes down to it, it comes down to having a plan, a strategy that you have the ability to tailor to meet your specific vision, your specific goals. It's very hard to work on something every day when you don't see success, when you don't see the instant rewards, the instant gratification. I think that's something that grit is trying to help us with. You're listening to My Strategy. I'm your host, John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. When we come back, we're going to talk about falling in love with boredom. That's what James Clear says that we need to be gritty. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio, and you're listening to My Strategy. Well, happy to have you with us today. Today we're talking about grit. Is it a driver of achievement and success, or could it lead you to a path of failure? We'd love to get your thoughts. Our studio lines are open at 866-451-1451. That's 866-451-1451. We'll be taking calls later in the show. Or if you'd like, send us an email at talk@johnmhawkins.com. That's talk@johnmhawkins.com. And if you do send us an email, you'll be entered in to win our giveaway, our weekly giveaway, where you can win one of my copies of my books, and then you will get a $25 Visa gift card. So right before the break, we were talking about developing your mental toughness. Talked about the West Point cadets, how competitors have to have higher grit scores than intelligence scores, which may be an indicator of success. In this segment, I want to talk about an interesting article that I came across by James Clear. He says, you need to fall in love with boredom. What does he mean by that? Fall in love with boredom. He says, and his article is titled, How to Fall in Love with Boredom. He says here, mastery is never an accident. You can win the lottery or become rich overnight, but no one has ever mastered their craft by chance. Whether you're talking about athletes, artists, or academics, the story is the same. If you want to fulfill your potential, then you must practice a specific skill for a long time with remarkable consistency. He references Paul Erdos, the fantastic mathematician. Well, this fantastic mathematician published over 1,500 papers before establishing himself as a thought leader. 1,500 papers. Famous composers put in 10 years of underappreciated work before earning recognition. Milo of Croton, who was a legendary Greek wrestler, picked up a young calf every day until he developed incredible strengths. So if you're in a situation where you're seeking to do something that is remarkable, amazing, stellar, it takes effort, it takes determination, it takes what we're calling grit. It says here, somehow top performers in any craft figure out a way to fall in love with their boredom, put in their reps, and do the work. So this is something that's interesting to me. James Clear says that you need to fall in love with boredom, that doing these reps that the famous mathematician Paul Erdos did, or the famous composer did, or Milo of Croton did to be successful. He says, of course, whenever experts share their stories about successful people, they often leave out a key ingredient of the story. How exactly do top performers fall in love with boredom? Perhaps more important, how can you fall in love with boredom when you're trying to build a habit that you know you should do but really don't want to do? And I think that's an interesting point. How do we do something we don't want to do? He says, first, there's little hope for falling in love with a habit that you truly hate. He doesn't know anyone who legitimately dislikes an activity and somehow falls in love with it, and it doesn't add up. It's very difficult to hate something and be in love with it all at the same time. He suggests one of the things is like disliking working out. You do it because it's good for you. If you want to fall in love with boredom out of going to the gym, then you have two options. So he's got two options for us. He says, one, increase your proficiency at the task. Or the second option is fall in love with the result of the task rather than itself. So the proficiency or the result. Even tasks that you're good at feel monotonous some days. So imagine an uphill battle you're fighting, and if you're consistently trying to do something that you don't feel skilled at, the solution is go back to the basic fundamentals of the tasks and celebrate the small wins and improvements you make. With our workout example, he goes through and talks about how you could go about doing that, and he specifically refers to proper deadlift or bench pressing. I won't go into too many details there. But that's one of the options, is to increase your proficiency. Get good at it. So skilled, so good that you enjoy doing it. Second is fall in love with the results, and I think that might be the one that I would tend to foster more. Let's be real, he says. There are some things that we should do that are always going to be a hassle. Running sprints, for example, very few people look forward to setting their lungs on fire. He says he finds that he has more success in situations like these when he shifts his focus away from the task and towards the result. Sometimes this is a direct result of the habit he's trying to perform. Other times it is a result that he invents. For example, you can make a game out of not missing workouts even if you don't enjoy the workout itself. He talks about some ways to do that, working out. I think this is an important point that James makes with regard to persistence, grit, being able to stick to the tasks, do something that is boring. But all of this needs patience. He goes on to talk about how he was having a conversation with a friend at the gym, and they decided that his weightlifting routine, despite making good progress, was the old program, and he asked him why. He said he made few excuses before eventually asking him because he got bored. And Mr. Clear, has learned the lesson that you've got to have patience. Working through achieving greatness, accomplishing your goals, isn't going to come overnight. Grit, determination, sticking to it, having the power to persevere takes patience. It all takes patience. You're not going to accomplish a seemingly insurmountable goal overnight. The way you do that, and as Mr. Clear had mentioned earlier, was, win the lottery or inherit money, but that's not going to help you with your craft. And I think that's something that's important here. When you're focusing on a craft, when you're focusing on becoming better at doing something, it does take a certain level of perseverance. You're listening to My Strategy. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Well, when we come back, we're going to talk about, can too much grit cause you to fail? The research suggests that it is a possibility. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I'm your host, John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio, and you're listening to My Strategy. Happy to have you here today. Today we've been talking about grit. Talking about, is grit a driver of achievement and success, or is it a path to failure? Right before the break, we were talking about falling in love with boredom. That was the opinion of James Clear. James Clear suggests that to have grit, you have to fall in love with things that might seem boring, that are monotonous. He talks about, perfecting your craft. This segment, I want to talk about grit in a different light. I want to talk about grit and how it may cause you to fail. Some articles out there that suggest that grit, having too much tenacity, can cause you to fail. So while we're talking about grit and increasing it, we also want to think about the downside of it. Got an article here by Amy Morin. She talks about grit. Article title is Having Too Much Grit Could Actually Cause You to Fail. She says the benefits of grit are undeniable. Overcoming obstacles, persevering through tough times, and maintaining passion for long-term goals often set successful people apart from the crowd. But she goes on to say, a multitude of research studies support the notion that grittier individuals are more likely to reach certain life goals, which we've concluded based on earlier research. They enjoy such benefits as higher GPAs, better outcomes, certain academic tests, superior performance in the workplace. She says despite the positive aspects of grit, Amy says there are some downsides to being overly determined. And she cites new research that shows it's possible to have too much tenacity. First is with misplaced effort. A gritty individual refusal to give up could actually become their downfall, according to a study published in the Journal of Research in Personality. Through a series of studies, researchers from the University of South Carolina and Northeastern University discovered that too much perseverance can be costly. It says here one aspect of grittiness involves effort. Average people put in a lot of effort when things are going well, but their effort tends to decline when they aren't getting the results that they want. Grittier individuals, however, increase their efforts when they aren't seeing the results they want. Whether they're losing in a competition, or they aren't meeting their sales quotas, they kick into high gear when failure looks probable. And while that persistence can be helpful in many circumstances, researchers found their steadfastness may backfire in certain situations. Take, for example, the SAT scores. When a test taker encounters a difficult question that will take a fair amount of time to solve, best practice involves skipping that problem, moving on to the next question. But rather than doing that, the grittier individual will put more effort into solving the problem, even if it takes longer to arrive at the solution. Their persistence in finding the answer may cause them to run out of time before finishing the test. Ultimately, they need to persist on individual questions. Ultimately, their need to persist on an individual question harms their overall score. Second thing she talks about is blind persistence. It says here, even when they're fighting a losing battle, grittier individuals refuse to give up. Sometimes that steadfastness can be detrimental. Researchers found that grittier individuals weren't willing to throw in the towel, even when offered financial incentives to quit. They refused. Instead, they opted to keep going despite inevitable failure. Sounds like another trait, stubbornness. There are many times when a stubborn refusal to admit defeat could be harmful. An entrepreneur operating a failing business may insist on continuing, despite the ongoing financial burden. His desire to press on could dig him deeper into the economic hole. Ultimately, he may find himself in complete financial ruin. Similarly, a leader who insists on making the company succeed in a specific area or direction may impair the company's overall performance. Their grit could lead to tunnel vision that causes them to disregard the bigger picture. And how true is this? Or we've got situations where we're so gritty, we're so determined, we're so ready to accomplish that specific goal. We focus on that objective. We focus on our craft. We focus on that, but that might not be the best thing for us to do. She suggests it's important to find a balance. There's a lot of inspirational posters and internet memes that tout messages such as champions never quit or quitters last forever. But changing course or giving up isn't always a bad thing. The grittiest of individuals may benefit from finding a balance between blind persistence and a defeatist mindset. Interesting. Blind persistence and the defeatist mindset. Knowing when to quit and giving yourself permission to do so may help you achieve your biggest goals. Interesting perspective Amy has. I think as we go through and work on our strategies on a weekly basis, we have a good sense of that. The strategic plans that we put together help us balance our goals. The regular cadence help us to look at our objectives, our goals, our vision, and we do fine-tuning as we see that things are not working. But if one just focuses on being a gritty individual, they might start to focus on that craft or that specific activity, and they're not going to gain the advantages of the world around them. They're not going to find other opportunities that might help them in other ways that they didn't see coming. I think that might be what the moral of the story is that Amy's trying to tell us, is that while she does agree that it is important to be gritty, that there are some downsides to having too much grit. But I think there's downsides to every trait that we could possibly have. There's also upsides, and the key is balancing and figuring out when is too much too much. You're listening to My Strategy. I'm your host, John M. Hawkins, coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Well, when we come back, we're going to talk about the hype behind grit. You'll be right back. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I'm your host, John M. Hawkins. You're listening to My Strategy, and we're on the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. This week we're talking about grit. Is it a driver of achievement and success, or perhaps a path to failure? Would love to get your thoughts. You can send an email to talk@johnmhawkins.com. That's talk@johnmhawkins.com. If you do send an email, you can be entered into our weekly giveaway, where you get a copy of one of my books you choose and a $25 Visa gift card. Right before the break, we were talking about, can too much grit cause you to fail? The segment, I want to talk about a little bit of science behind it and talking about beyond grit and sheer willpower, and start to think about what we should do from a strategic perspective. Got an article here by Elizabeth Harris. She's talking about the science of getting beyond mere grit and willpower. She mentions a HSBC, which is a large banking company. They gave the public a gentle nudge to encourage people to persevere with their New Year's resolutions with a post-it note wall of letters in London at Victoria Station on January 18th of 2016 in London, England. She goes on to say, Dr. John Norcross, who is a distinguished professor of psychology at the University of Scranton, and Dr. Norcross started studying about grit in 1980. That's when he first started it. He started fielding questions leading up to January 17th that many in circles were calling Ditch Your New Year's Resolution Day. Not because he was surprised to get calls about the topic of resolutions. After all, Dr. Norcross is a researcher who has studied how to make people's make lasting changes, including examining New Year's resolutions, and also wrote a book, Changeology. Rather, what disturbed Norcross was how the creation of such a day, and the day is the HSBC Resolution Day, may underscore some stubborn, persistent ideas that some people are endowed with a kind of natural ability to change, and that willpower or personal grit alone can suffice. It's a return to a more conservation within the person's traditions. Grit is perseverance. You just need to put your head down, pick up your shoestrings, Norcross says. Unfortunately, an over-reliance on grit, like willpower, ignores the other essential skills that predicts who succeeds much better. Again, talking about do we have too much grit? Is the hype real? Here, Mr. Norcross is talking about how he has concerns. It turns out the emphasis on skills, not innate capacity, is necessary for anyone who is trying to break or start a habit ranging from quitting smoking, increasing exercise, or increasing savings and cut spending. Turns out an emphasis on skills, not the capacity, is necessary for anyone who is trying to break or start a habit. And we talked a little bit about that with James Clear. It says here, when Norcross, the distinguished professor, he suspected that addictive behaviors would require a different kind of change than, say, planning to eat more healthy. But Norcross's research showed the development of skills can prove predictive of the likelihood of success, including the chance that you will be among the roughly 40% of Americans whose New Year's resolutions stick. I think this is just another indication that it isn't just about having grit and determination. Willpower alone is not going to help you accomplish your objectives, but it's going to take more than that. I think that's why it's important for us to have a systematic approach where we start to think and become aware of what our goals are. We need to think about assessing and analyzing what we are doing, strategizing and planning, implement a plan, and then get the support and evaluation we need. What is your vision? What are your goals? If you're going to use grit, determination, sheer willpower, and you're going to focus on something, whether it's a skill or trying to accomplish a goal, if you do get good at that skill, if you do accomplish that goal, what is all of that going to lead up to? We have to think about the assessment and analyzing of our situation. If we are focused on a goal and we've got the grit, we've got the determination, why is it that we're not meeting those goals or objectives? And that comes down to the things that we're working on a daily basis, our strategy, our plan, the course of actions that we're on. Now, the strategy is the course of actions, and it might not be visible to other people. But the tactics we choose are the visible things that people will see. So if your course of actions and you have a strategy to get back in shape, people might not know what you are trying to do, but they might see you at the gym, see you a few times at the gym, and those are the tactics that you're using to meet your ultimate goal. So I think it's important to start thinking about this from a strategic perspective. What are those tactical things that you are doing on a daily basis? How can grit help you in that respect? And try and find the balance to apply grit, to be persistent, to have the patience, but we have to do it in a systematic approach. It's not something that we can just turn on grit and determination and be the grittiest, most determined person out there. Because what if you're focusing on something that doesn't align with core values or doesn't align with a vision or goal that you want to accomplish? You can follow in many people's footsteps. Challenge is that by following in their footsteps, you will probably end up in the same place they are. In some cases, if you're lucky, that's a good thing. But if that isn't your goal, it isn't your vision, you can spend a lot of time investing a lot of time and effort and monies and resources. And when you get to that final goal, that might not be where you want to be. I think that's what's important for us to, when we start thinking about the science behind it, when we start thinking about how much grit and determination we need to have. And that's why it's important with my strategy on a daily basis when I think about this show. You know, it's really to start to evaluate daily actions, daily accomplishments, daily success. Track it. Go back through and identify what's working, what's not. If it's not working, adjust. You're listening to My Strategy. I am your host, John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Well, when we come back, we're going to talk about putting your plan in place. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I'm your host, John M. Hawkins. You're listening to My Strategy, and we're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Well, happy to be here and really glad you could join us. This show, we've been talking about grit and talking about, is it a driver of achievement and success, or could it be a path to failure? We've been talking about grit and determination. Still love to get your thoughts. Send us an email to talk@johnmhawkins.com. That's talk@johnmhawkins.com. You have a few more minutes to get entered into our weekly giveaway before we draw the winner. In case you missed this broadcast, you can listen on iHeartRadio, Apple, iTunes, or if you'd like to have something covered on the show, send an email again to talk@johnmhawkins.com, or you can give us a call at 1-844-MY-STRATEGY. That's 1-844-MY-STRATEGY. We've been talking today about grit. What is grit? We went through the definition of grit and learned some synonyms about what grit is and why it was important. And I think from my perspective, grit is something that is absolutely important for us to be able to develop our mental toughness, to commit to things when we need to accomplish a specific goal. And grit is that mental toughness can help you do it. We learned that, the West Point cadets who scored higher on their grit test did far better than their peers. We also learned that the competitors who did better on their grit tests and had lower capabilities, perhaps talent or mental capabilities, were still able to accomplish their goal. And by mental, I mean smarter, as opposed to, not other types of disabilities. We then learned something that was interesting to me, and James Clear suggested that we fall in love with boredom. He again went on to talk about how there's a mathematician out there who had to publish 1,500 papers before he became known as a thought leader. Talked about a famous composers and also Milo of Croydon, who to become strong lifted an animal every day until he had super strength. But in order to be able to do that, I think it's important for you to find a way to fall in love with the boredom, the monotony of doing a task over and over again. And that's something that you're going to have to face and think about if you're trying to become more gritty. We then talked a little bit about how having too much grit may cause you to fail. Research showed that having too much tenacity can lead to blind persistence. And when you have too much focus on a specific objective, you can lose out and miss out on other opportunities. The examples that were referenced were a business person who is trying to grow a business and maybe it isn't the right market, or we know that that business will ultimately fail. That gritty person might not give up on the business. Reminds me of stubbornness. And at some point, we need to be able to recognize when grit is good and when it's not. And it all comes down to a nice, healthy balance. And I think it all comes down to whether or not if you have a habit, you need to be aware of that habit. You need to be aware of those patterns. And if grit is one of those things that you're lacking, start working on it. Start developing it. Set up your daily routines to support developing a gritty attitude, gritty behaviors. But all this is going to take conscious prioritization and commitment to your goals and intentions. It's going to take you focusing on those specific goals and making sure that grit is going to help you achieve them. That's all the time for today. You've been listening to My Strategy. I'm your host, John M. Hawkins. We came to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Hope to see you next time.